When you talk about this moral framework or the moral straitjacket that the country finds itself in or beholden to, like, how would you what is that? How would you describe that? Like, what are the four corners of that moral framework?
I think it's in simple terms, the moral framework is the worst thing, the worst possible, the worst conceivable offense, moral offense, is not, uh, you know, rape. It's not murder. It's not anything horrible that you can imagine. The worst conceivable offense is this term, so-called racism, and a term that's very kind of ambiguously defined so as to basically keep those who are in charge in possession of the dominant moral high ground. And what you see this, unfortunately, they never learn, these Republican types. They're so obsessed with proving that they're not racist, where the goalposts are always moving. They don't understand it's a game. They think it's about morality when it's about power. And so they crawl over the glass, they wash feet, they debase themselves in every possible way in order to prove whatever we are, we're not racist. It doesn't work. And that's the moral framework that we're stuck in. And until we kind of get out of that framework and say, I mean, yes, obviously racism properly defined is wrong, but it shouldn't be a national obsession. We need to move on and carry on with the business of building a civilization. And until people are willing to say that, standing up proudly and act upon it, this country will only become even more of a joke, if that's even possible.
What do you think it would take to break out of that framework?
I think it would take quite a few things in a kind of interesting discussion on sort of the efficacy of winning elections versus other kind of intangibles. I was suggesting that maybe winning elections isn't as important as people think intuitively, and raise the question of whether someone would rather win elections or control the media and maintain possession of the blackmail tapes. Now, I say that kind of facetiously, but I do think that control of the narrative is everything. And to control the narrative, it's nice to have control of the media, but you also need some other things, which the Republicans really need to work on. And
What
that's
are the
having the
what are
yeah.
the other things?
The other things are having the moral high ground. Because the Republicans are so obsessed with proving they're not racist, and racist is a term owned and controlled by the left, they will never have the moral high ground. And moral imperialism always beats individual indifference. And what I mean by that is juxtapose the slogan, silence is violence, with don't tread on me. Silence is violence is morally imperialistic, and it will always beat don't tread on me. And it registers the fact that the left, for all its faults, has the moral high ground, and that's why they win. And so until Republicans can be just as confident in being protectors of civilization against barbarism and destruction, and defend civilization as such with the same kind of moral fervor that the left attempts to tear it down with words like racism, until they're prepared to do that, they will lose. And so that's the moral framework. And having the moral high ground gives you the confidence to hold frame in a discussion. If you'll allow me, I'd like to kind of reformulate what I mean by this. Is a lot of conservatives have this idea of, we are the responsible adults and the left are these misguided children. But they're misguided on the basis of more or less just principles, equality, and so forth. And as long as you have this idea that we're the responsible adults, but they are the irresponsible children, but animated by a just moral principle, again, you will always lose, because the moral indifference always caves to moral imperialism and moral fervor. And the right, not just the right, really just any American who looks at what's happening is disgusted by it, needs to fortify themselves with this sense of moral fervor, that what's happening is wrong. And not only are you just going to sit back and say it's wrong, but you are going to defend against it with the same kind of conviction, the same kind of fervor, the same kind of aggressiveness, and even imperialism that the left uses to destroy everything that is just and beautiful and elevated in the country. So I think just the mental frameworks that a lot of the conservatives, a lot of the, especially the official Republicans, hold or think they have to hold, are just losing frameworks from the very beginning. You have to have moral conviction sufficient to hold your frame and not cave in. And incidentally, I think a lot of your listeners have watched the exchange with Tucker Carlson and the Senator
Mike Braun
Brown,
from Indiana,
whoever he was, and just that's, not even to single him out, because he's just one weak mediocrity in a sea of many. He's the rule, not the exception, when it comes to Republican politicians. And he was basically saying something like, "Oh, we need to be part of the conversation," as though like he's, he might as well have been washing Senator Schumer's feet. He just wants an opportunity to be in physical proximity to Schumer's feet. And if he doesn't completely kowtow to the moral framework that Schumer shoves down his throat, then he's just, out of consideration, and the Republicans lose. And so in order to even just have a place by the feet of someone like Schumer, you have to totally capitulate to their moral framework. I mean, it was truly a pathetic display, but instructive, because it gives you a sense of the just weak and almost masochistic mindset of these Republican politicians. And even masochistic might be too favorable, because that suggests a kind of complexity of perversion. It's just masochism plus just pure cattle stupidity.
I watched that interview between with Tucker Carlson and Mike Braun, and I guess I just thought it was kind of like you. I thought that it's not just him. Like, he's just your basic Republican Congress creature from central casting. He could have been anybody, and the opening bid from Republicans is always the same. Let's start off with my terms of surrender, and let's see if I can lose slightly more slowly and on slightly less bad terms. And that was, I mean, that's my TLDR of what his justification for his bill was.
100%. And like, another way to put it is, these people, they're just simple idiots who are just happy to be there. Like, I bet this Senator Braun is like, he thinks it's such a cool thing. He's a senator and he gets to wear, a pin on his clothes, and his family all just really proud of how he made it. And he's just happy to be at the table. He's not playing for keeps. He wouldn't know how to play for keeps if his life depended on it. So he's just some simple, weak person who's probably totally beaten around by narratives that he doesn't even understand how they've been jammed in his head, and is operating with a kind of default operating system that's designed to lose.
Yeah, I had this sort of frame that for a lot of Republicans and conservatives, which is, and he certainly falls into this group, which is, they're sort of like the third generation in a family that has a very successful family enterprise.
Right.
They have no idea how it happened. They're way different than the founding generation that started the company and grew it. Their parents actually had a sense of the fact that, their parents started this company. There were some struggles along the way. Yes, they were building something. But by the time you get to the third generation, you're just too far removed. And you're just spending the money with a kind of a sense that, I know I didn't make it. I know I kind of don't deserve it, and I'm just going to try and make sure there's something left for my kids. But I know already at the beginning it's going to be less than what I started with because I'm going to spend a certain amount in my life.
Right.
And they're not building anything, right? That's the
Right.
fundamental difference. There's people
They're
who are
not they're
builders and
not
people who are
building
spenders.
because, once they start to put brick upon brick, someone shouts in their ear that says doing that is racist, and they say, okay, I'm not going to put another brick on this building.
So,
because they think that being racist as this fake word that their enemy uses, that's worse than letting the civilization that their ancestors built crumble to barbarians.
you said something interesting, kind of provocative. You said silence is violence will always beat don't tread on me. Why is that?
Yes, because silence is violence is a morally imperialistic position. I think the game theory of it is pretty dispositive. That silence is violence is not just, live and let live. You can think whatever you want. Silence is violence means that neutrality is not an option. That neutrality means you're against us. And in fact, this only kind of exhibited itself really conspicuously in this latest round of, the latest stage of our ongoing cultural revolution, whereas in previous episodes like this, you had two options. If you were some kind of, mainstream institution, you could just be quiet about it, or you could say something about it, but say something that's kind of approved by the commissars, approved by the woke commissars, whatever you want to call them. Now it wasn't even an option to remain neutral. Unless you expressed affirmative approval for the Black Lives Matter movement, for all these kinds of things, you were assumed to be an evil racist who believed the opposite, and therefore it was morally okay to destroy you, to beat you, to do anything to destroy your life, either physically or economically or otherwise. And that kind of aggressive position, we might find it abhorrent, but because we find the morals behind it abhorrent, but that will always beat the position of don't tread on me, I'm just here, I don't want to expand, I don't want to impose, I just want to live in my little area and not be bothered. That it might be a noble position. It's a position that personally I do kind of resonate with, but the reality is that is not a winning position, and it will never be a winning position against something like silence is violence. And so I think it really underscores the necessity for internalizing a moral upper high ground that is not simply this inversion of the fake moral structures generated by the ruling class in the United States. And as long as the kind of Republicans are stumbling over themselves either to prove they're not racist or to prove through some kind of, cute low IQ argument that the other side is somehow more racist than they are, like these are just very, very easy traps to fall into. And the whole moral and discursive architecture that governs this country is set up to neutralize those approaches. And so there needs to be this independent sense of moral conviction that does not simply presuppose and internalize the ideological weaponry constructed and controlled by the ruling class.
You have to, in politics, you have to not only be willing to, but you have to have the desire to actually rule and use political power.
Right.
Right. And that is, that's a place where conservatives, I think, they have a hard time. It wasn't always this way. I mean, the argument, it's sort of like this perversion of the argument for things like federalism or subsidiarity or whatever, which is to say the government, we want government close to the people. We don't want it to be abusive. But I think inside of that is where we think government has an appropriate role to play. It should play that role with strongly with effectiveness and with efficiency.
Right.
And that's somehow been changed into just sort of this milk toasty thinking, like, well, we're conservatives, we're opposed to the government, so we have power. We're just going to go into neutral and not do anything.
Right.
And that's first of all, it's stupid.
Right.
Like it's just a misunderstanding of what sort of historical conservative positions were. But also, you're guaranteed to lose. Right.
Right.
Like one of my frustrations of many, I've got a litany of them, but is, sort of this never ending debate about the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. It's
Right.
several $100 million. It's never going away. Okay.
Right.
And yet how much time, how much breath, and how much ink has been wasted by conservatives over the past 40 years about how once we get power, we're defunding the NEA, we're defunding the NEH. Well, you're not. Okay,
Right.
you haven't. You've been misleading everybody about that for 4 decades. And
Right.
if you did, why would things be better? Like, again, to my old point, is that going to bring manufacturing back to Michigan?
Right.
Is that going to make somebody's life tangibly better? And third is, if you're in power, right, there is a totally legitimate place in the public sphere for support of the arts. There's a multi-millennial history of that. Just put good people in place to run those institutions. They could actually do some good. They could actually encourage beauty. That's why I think one of the things, one of the most important executive orders Trump has signed is the one mandating classical architecture on federal buildings. He got beaten up for about 2 days, but he actually took a stand for an aesthetic that had beauty in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that was certainly it's big if true. We'll see how it plays out.
Yeah,
but
right.
I think the spirit of it is definitely admirable. Just a couple things to add to that. I think that I guess I want to get a little bit greedier. Like I would want to expect if, the people that I would support politically would be able to understand and exercise power to the extent that if they really wanted, they could get rid of the NEH and NEA, but also with the understanding that the real gripe against these is not some kind of lame, deflective, quote unquote principled, like libertarian stand that this is, an unjust encroachment of government function. The real gripe about these is that they're promoting ugly and degenerate art. And so, I would want the politicians I support to be able to defund or eliminate entirely if they wanted to. But I would also want them to understand that the real problem with these is not some big government, small government thing. The real problem is that because the institutions have all been captured, the NEH and NEA will serve as vehicles for the same kind of cultural poison that inhabits the perverse moral frameworks that I've been talking about. And that is really the core battle going on. And, if you have the know-how and the resources and the will to overcome that moral framework and substitute it for one that is salutary and beautiful and that sustains kind of the civilizational ethos, then that should be done. And that's far more important than any kind of fake ideological distinction between, big government, small government, or what the proper role of government per se would be. It's all about, what's being promoted by the institution, whether it's government or not. And this fake distinction has served as a remarkably effective cope for those on the right. It goes back to the kind of the proverbial, private company, public company. Oh, we're against big government, but we're just going to outsource every kind of totalitarian function to the private sector, just like what's happened in the military. And then it's all okay. It's amazing how that works. And so now when, an enormous...
It's intolerable when government does it. It's fine when Amazon does it.
Exactly. And so I think that some people are kind of unsophisticated enough to actually believe those distinctions. I think still, although this is waning, there's a certain degree of money and incentive for people kind of entering into the professional kind of political commentator pipeline to believe those, and people kind of internalize beliefs that are in their own financial incentive. But I think it also just largely a kind of cope and just kind of a deflective apparatus to say, well, we can't do anything about it, so we're going to excuse that by falling back on some fake principle as to why, we can't do anything about it. It's not that we're ineffective, it's simply that we're principled, when really in practice, ineffective and principled have become conflated terms when it comes to conservative politics for quite some time.
Principled is usually just a code word for cowardice, or I lost.
Correct.
And I want to make myself feel better about losing.